Every generation in human history has believed that children are getting worse. The ancient Greeks complained about it, the Romans wrote about it, medieval European clergy preached about it, and somewhere in your family there is an older relative who has said some version of it to you personally. Children today have no respect. They don't listen. They don't know how good they have it. This is not a new complaint. This is possibly the oldest complaint in human history, and this video is not here to settle that debate. This video is here to show you what happened to children who were considered bad, difficult, disobedient, or simply inconvenient across the ancient world. Because the answer involves exposure on hillsides, legal death sentences, gladiator training, and one colonial American law that allowed parents to execute their own children for talking back. Ancient Sparta, Rome, Egypt, China, medieval Europe, the Puritans. We are going everywhere, and by the end of this video, you will understand that the history of child discipline is not really a history of children at all. It is a history of what adults decided children owed them, and what they were willing to collect. Let us start in ancient Sparta, because Sparta, more than any other civilization in this video, decided that the most efficient solution to a bad child was to simply not have one. When a Spartan child was born, it was not taken home by its parents. It was taken to a group of elders. A council of older Spartan men examined the infant for physical defects, weakness, or anything that suggested the child would not become a useful soldier. If the elders approved, the child was returned to its family. If they did not, the infant was taken to a place called the Apothete, a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus, and left there. This was not considered cruel by Spartan standards. It was considered practical. A weak Spartan was not a Spartan. It was a liability, and Sparta had no budget for liabilities. For the children who passed the inspection and survived infancy, the real work began at age 7. At 7, Spartan boys were removed from their families and entered the agoge, a state-run educational and military training program that made every boarding school you have ever heard of look like a weekend retreat. The agoge was designed around one principle: discomfort was a teacher. Boys slept on reeds they had to cut themselves from the riverbank. They were given minimal food and encouraged to steal the rest, not because Sparta approved of stealing, but because if you got caught stealing, you were beaten, not for taking the food, for being caught. The lesson was not don't steal, the lesson was don't get caught, which tells you quite a lot about what Spartan society was actually training these children to become. The most famous test was the cheese altar. Boys were required to steal cheese from the altar of the goddess Artemis Orthia, while other Spartans whipped them. The goal was to steal the cheese without showing pain. Boys died doing this. The ones who didn't became Spartan soldiers. Bad behavior in Sparta was not punished with a conversation or a consequence. It was punished with pain delivered by the state. And the definition of bad was simple: weakness. Ancient Rome had a legal concept called patria potestas. Translated from Latin, it means the power of the father. And the power of the father in ancient Rome was, legally speaking, absolute. A Roman father had the right to determine whether his newborn child lived or died. Infants were laid at his father's feet after birth. If he picked up the child, it joined the family. If he walked away, the child was exposed. A Roman father had the right to sell his children into slavery. A Roman father had the right to disinherit, punish, imprison, or execute members of his household, including adult children. This authority did not end when the child grew up. A Roman son remained under patria potestas until his father died or formally released him, which meant that a 40-year-old Roman senator, a man with his own career and household, was still technically under the legal authority of his elderly father. In practice, Roman fathers rarely executed their adult children, but the legal right existed, and it was used enough times that Roman legal scholars felt the need to write about the appropriate limits of it, which means the limits were not obvious. For Roman children who were considered bad in the more ordinary sense, disobedient, disrespectful, academically failing, the primary corrective tool was the schoolmaster. Roman education was physical. A student who gave a wrong answer was beaten. A student who was late was beaten. A student who was inattentive was beaten. The Roman educator Quintilian, writing in the 1st century CE, actually argued against beating children in schools, on the grounds that it was humiliating and counterproductive. His colleagues largely ignored him. Quintilian's position was considered soft. He was, by Roman educational standards, a radical. Ancient Egypt is the unexpected entry in this list, because while Sparta was leaving infants on hillsides and Rome was codifying paternal execution rites, Egyptian texts from as far back as 2000 BCE describe a relationship between parents and children that looks, by comparison, almost modern. Egyptian wisdom literature, texts designed to teach young men how to navigate adult life, frequently mentions the emotional bonds between parents and children, the love a mother has for her child, the responsibility a father feels for his son's future. This does not mean Egyptian children were not disciplined. Scribal schools, where young Egyptian men were trained to read and write, had a saying that appears in multiple texts. The ear of a boy is on his back. He hears when he is beaten. Physical punishment was standard in Egyptian education, but the framework around it was different. Egyptian texts describe discipline as an act of love, something a caring parent did to prepare a child for a difficult world, not something a parent did because the child had disrupted the social order. The distinction sounds subtle. It is not subtle. It is the difference between punishment as preparation and punishment as control. Egypt was doing the former. Most of the other civilizations in this video were doing the latter. Ancient China built its society on a concept called filial piety, the absolute respect and obedience owed by children to their parents. This was not a cultural preference. It was a philosophical and legal framework codified in Confucian texts and enforced by the state. A child who struck a parent could be executed. A child who verbally abused a parent could be executed. A child who filed a legal complaint against a parent could be executed. The parent, in Chinese legal and philosophical tradition, was not just an authority figure. The parent was a representative of the social and cosmic order. Disobeying a parent was not just a family matter. It was an offense against the structure of the universe. The 24 Examples of Filial Piety, a collection of stories used to teach children proper behavior, contain entries that make the cheese altar look reasonable. One story describes a man who allowed mosquitoes to bite him every night rather than swat them away so that the mosquitoes would feed on him instead of his sleeping parents. Another describes a man who tasted his elderly father's feces each day to monitor his health. These were not horror stories. They were presented as models of ideal behavior, examples to aspire to. A bad child in ancient China was not simply a child who broke rules. It was a child who failed to subordinate every aspect of their existence to the needs and comfort of their parents. The standard was total, and the consequences for failing to meet it were written into law. Medieval European scholars had an interesting solution to the question of how to deal with bad children. They decided that all children were bad, by definition. The theological framework, inherited from Augustine of Hippo, held that children were born in original sin. The human soul arrived corrupted. The work of childhood, and of the adults responsible for it, was to beat that corruption out before it took permanent hold. This was not metaphorical. The rod was literal. Spare the rod and spoil the child comes from the book of Proverbs and was taken with complete seriousness by medieval educators and parents. The historian Philippe Arias argued in his 1960 work, Centuries of Childhood, that medieval Europeans didn't really have a concept of childhood as a distinct life stage. Children were treated as small adults as soon as they were physically capable of working, which was roughly age 7. Age 7 was considered the age of reason. Before 7, a child was not fully morally accountable. After 7, they were. The transition was not gradual. One day you were 7, the next day you were accountable for your soul. And if you behaved badly, the adults around you had both the right and the religious obligation to correct that, by whatever means they considered necessary. The Puritans of colonial New England took this framework and amplified it. In 1646, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law called the Stubborn Child Law. It stated that a son over 16 years old who was stubborn, rebellious, and would not obey his parents could be brought before a magistrate and put to death. The law was never enforced. No child was executed under it, but it was on the books because someone thought it was necessary to write it down. And somewhere in that room of Puritan legislators, not a single person said, "This seems like too much." They all nodded, they all signed, they went home. And that tells you more about Puritan ideas of childhood than any sermon ever could. Here is what every civilization in this video had in common: Sparta, Rome, China, medieval Europe, the Puritans. In every case, the definition of a bad child was a child who did not comply. Not a cruel child, not a dangerous child, not a child causing genuine harm,
but a disobedient one. And in every case, the severity of the punishment was proportional not to the harm the child had caused, but to how completely the adult's authority had been challenged. The Spartan boy beaten at the cheese altar was not being punished for stealing. He was being punished for being seen. The Roman son under Patria Potestas was not subject to execution for being dangerous. He was subject to it for being disobedient. The Puritan stubborn child law did not define stubborn as violent or threatening. It defined it as refusing to obey. Every generation in human history has believed that children are getting worse, and every generation has built systems of control around that belief. The question this history leaves behind is not whether children were actually worse then. It is who got to define what worse meant, and whether the people making that definition ever asked themselves whether the problem was the children or the standard they were being measured against. If this video made you think about something differently, subscribe. Every week we go back into the parts of history that didn't make it into your textbooks. Leave a like if this one stayed with you. Until next time, stay curious.